Subscribe to our YouTube channel for in-depth interviews of India Inc. and press the bell icon so that you do not miss our updates.
Hello and welcome to Nirmal Bang, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hiral Dadia. We have with us Mr. Dheeraj Nair, Chief Economist, Vedanta, former Head, Economics, Finance and Commerce at Niti Aayog, joining in. Welcome to the show, Dheeraj. Dheeraj, my first question coming to you over here is with regards to the kind of transition and the kind of impact that we've seen on the back of COVID-19. What's happened is every economy, every sector that has been impacted. Now, if you have to look at developing countries from here on, how are you seeing the growth prospects being impacted?
Uh, well, I think let's be clear that this is an unprecedented and historic shock to the economies around the world, whether it's developed or developing.
Mm.
But naturally, for developing countries or emerging economies, the stakes are higher in the sense that our per capita incomes are much lower. There are many people who are just above the poverty line. Governments have much less resources. So, any adverse shock has far greater consequences. Now, we know for a fact in the first quarter, GDP fell by minus 23.9. For the year, it may be about minus 10. That's what most of the forecasts seem to suggest, which means that we'll have to grow by more than 10% in the following year, which is 21-22, to just be back at the same position as we were before COVID. So effectively, we are losing 2 years, and not just we, a lot of countries will lose 2 years and be,
Mm.
at the same position that they were pre-COVID. So I think that is not good because when we talk about emerging economies, we generally assume that they will grow positively, if not at 9-10%, at least at 5-6%, because the
Mm.
potential for growth is huge. So I think there is a bit of a loss, but as I said, this is a black swan event, and there's not really anything much anybody could do about it. But as we may discuss further in the discussion, there are several measures which can be taken to make sure that we don't lose too much time, and that when the proper revival takes place, we are in a position to capitalize. Because I think now there are going to be several changes in the world economy, in the way, in terms of technology, in terms of trade, in terms of the way the public health emergency is going to shape the way we live. And I think you can look at it as a challenge on the one hand, but I like to look at it as an opportunity, particularly for emerging countries. All such disruptions give us a unique opportunity to grow faster and to catch up
Mm.
faster with the
Mm.
advanced countries. I think we are much more nimble in many ways than some of the advanced countries are. So, admittedly, the next 1 or 2 years will be tough. But after that, I foresee a good period going forward.
Absolutely. And country like India, Dheeraj, what we've always noticed is that the best of the reforms have come in and have been executed in times of crisis. So probably, this could be a blessing in disguise that we could be looking at, as you're saying. And with this, Dheeraj, we've seen two crises. One is the health emergency, and the other is the sharp economic downturn. How do you think a country like India should deal with it from here on?
Yeah, well, the, the problematic bit about the situation, at least until recently, was that everything you needed to do to prevent the public health crisis getting worse would adversely affect economic activity. So whether it was a lockdown or social distancing, requires shutting down of large parts of the economy. Even now, when we've opened up most parts of the economy, there are certain sectors like travel, tourism, hospitality, which will be nowhere near the level they were before COVID. So I think what has happened, at least in the last 6 months, which one should be happy about, is that we figured out the disease is probably not as deadly as we thought at the start. There are better protocols to manage it. The mortality rate is fairly low, at least in India. So I think that has allowed us to open up a considerable amount of the economy. But I still think we need to, as citizens, have a consciousness about the potential threat, especially as winter comes along, so that we don't have to go into a situation where we need another lockdown or a restriction on economic activity. So everyone should wear masks and follow the necessary precautions, because I think going back to a stalling of economic activity will take us back even further. So now we have to, as they say, learn to live with the virus and learn to make the best of it. And with the necessary precautions, we've seen that it is possible to live with the virus. So it's an unusual situation. and until a vaccine comes, it will continue to be an unusual situation. But there are ways we are managing it. So I think we have to be responsible as citizens. So the government has its role to play in terms of the health infrastructure, in terms of communicating. But at the end of the day, all of us as citizens also have a role to play in complying with those recommendations.
Right. And then with this, even before COVID actually struck us, Dheeraj, if you look at the global merchandise export to GDP ratio, that was on a decline. And this was, in fact, the first time we ever saw this kind of a decline since World War II. And then we had COVID, which struck us. Now, do you think this is something negative from here on, or do you think this would probably fall in our stride, taking into consideration that exports is something which is doing well and picking up right now? Because a lot of people who want to ban China and come to India.
So the reality, as you said, was that trade was already seeing a pessimism around it. There was a backlash, from the advanced countries. You saw in the US with President Trump and his policies. In the UK, you saw Brexit. Now, these were the countries which were home to free trade and free markets and so on. So them turning their back, I think, and again, it was a long backlash against the 2008 global financial crisis, which average people thought had worked against them. Of course, it's a different matter that the crisis there was in finance and the backlash is against trade. I mean, trade did not lead to that crisis, but the backlash has been against trade. That said, the global merchandise trade market, even if it's not growing, is about $18 trillion. And, India has a very, very small share of it, about 1.5. China is about 14%. So even if the pie doesn't grow, that 18 trillion pie doesn't grow, suppose it even falls a little, as you're saying, it's still a very large pie. And for India, the challenge is to grab a greater share of that pie. So, if China is 14 and if people want to diversify away from China, if China is going to come down, can we go up from 1.5 to 4 or 5 in the foreseeable future, 5% of that 18 trillion? That will be a huge, huge contribution to GDP. So we don't even need global trade to grow. We just need to increase our share. But for that, we are going to have to become very competitive because ultimately competitiveness matters. Politics is one thing, but I can tell you that people did not go to China in the first place because they loved the authoritarian system or the Chinese system. Now China is being more aggressive, but I think it's the economic logic which will ultimately dictate people's decisions. So if they want to move out of China, they can always go to Vietnam or Bangladesh. They don't have to come to India. So we have to make ourselves the best option for all these companies looking to exit China. And I'm not pessimistic at all. I think exports can still provide us a boost as long as we become competitive.
Right. And with this, what's happened is, what's the kind of impact are you seeing, with regards to the process of deglobalization that was already underway? I mean, with COVID, what's the kind of impact you're looking at?
So, as I said, deglobalization to some extent is likely to continue in the sense that, free trade, free movement of people. There are certain countries, as I said, which were the leaders of propagating these ideas, which have turned against them. On the other hand, there are countries like India, China, Vietnam. There are many countries which still stand to benefit from the economy, right? So you need new advocates for globalization. If the old traditional advocates are exiting the fray, you need new countries to bat for globalization. And again, I think the economic logic, again, globalization, there may have been a political momentum behind it, but ultimately it's about producing cheap, high quality goods for citizens everywhere in the world. So even Americans can try and get all production back to the US, but they'll never be able to supply goods and services at the prices that China, Vietnam, or India can, right? So ultimately, those countries will also have to make a choice whether they are willing to pay that extra price to deglobalize, because deglobalization will have an economic price for everyone to pay. So I think there will be. I'm not saying we will see the kind of openness we saw between 1980 and 2015 or 2010. It's not going to be that kind of world, but I think the largest countries and the most emerging economies can still be open towards each other and give globalization a boost. And if the US and the advanced countries want to close up, well, they'll lose out. So it's for us to decide which side we want to be on. And I think we should still be on the side of globalization, not deglobalization.
Right. And then with this, another conversation that we've always been having, Dheeraj, was a $5 trillion economy. By how many years are we pushed behind on this front? Because clearly now the stance of the government has changed. They have to look at sustainability. They have to try to be resilient to this kind of an economic downturn.
Yes, so obviously, as I said, at the start, we've been pushed back by 2 years. So 2 years in 2022 will now be at the same level as we were in 2020. And I think the earlier aspiration was to try and get to 5 trillion by 2025 or thereabouts. It would have been tough anyway. But I think, eventually we will get to 5 trillion. Eventually we will get to 10 trillion. For me, what is more important is the speed at which we get there. Because we can get to 5 trillion by 2035 and 10 trillion by 2060, but let's try and get there earlier. So I think the target for us really should be growth. And as long as we grow at double digits after this crisis is over, and starting 2022, our aspiration should be nothing less than 10% annual growth. And once you target 10% annual growth, you'll see these targets 5 trillion, 10 trillion, just like China did. They'll come very, very quickly. And, you won't be satisfied with even 10 trillion, you'll be looking at 15 trillion. So let's target growth instead of 15 trillion or 10 trillion or 5 trillion, because speed matters more than the destination. We don't have all the time in the world. People need to get prosperous quickly.
Right. So the overall outlook with regards to growth again is that we could have a negative, probably a higher single-digit GDP in terms of where FY21 goes. Probably we could see some positivity in the first half of FY22, or maybe even in the second half of FY22. And yes, that would be a bigger jump because of a lower base. What is your assessment with regards to growth if you have to look at FY21 and 22?
Well, FY21 is almost certainly going to be hugely negative. I mean, whether we end up at -5, -10, or -50 will depend also on what the government does. I mean, if there is a bigger stimulus package in the offing in the next 2 or 3 months, or then you may minimize that negative fall. But I suspect we are going to be around -10, all things considered, and looking at the way the government has reacted so far. And I suspect that the following year we'll be at least +10 on the lower base. But as I said, +10 still doesn't get us back to where we were. We need to be at least +11 or 12 in the following year. But I suspect that by the fourth quarter of this year, or by the first quarter of next year, we'll start seeing things turn around. Unless this public health emergency takes a turn for the worse, we don't still know where it'll go in the winter months. But one is optimistic that a vaccine or better treatments will certainly be available sooner rather than later.
Right. And Dheeraj, if we are saying that growth should be the core focus for the economy as a whole, do you think inflation is something which could be probably ignored right now from a short to medium term perspective? And then once growth starts returning, that's when the government could start actually concentrating on the inflation bit, or that's something which is not really doable according to you?
Well, you see, the thing with inflation right now is that we know for sure that demand is so short that it cannot be demand-led inflation. Whatever inflation is there, 6-7%, I realize it's high, but it's because of supply disruptions, mostly on the agricultural side, but also certain logistical disruptions because of COVID. And I think at this point, focusing on inflation would be a folly, because that would mean you take a less accommodative stance on monetary policy, you raise interest rates. Nowhere in the world is the focus on inflation. I think, quite frankly, demand push inflation is dead for the foreseeable future, not only in India, but in the rest of the world. So I think inflation definitely not the focus, but I understand in India, politicians worry about inflation in particular because it affects votes when prices rise. But given that it's not a demand-led thing, the focus should be on addressing the supply side issues. And I think some of the agricultural reforms which have been announced, the abolition of APMCs, the abolition of the amendment of the Essential Commodities Act, those will help stabilize the kind of food supply disruptions which lead to food inflation. So I'm not at all worried about inflation right now, and I hope those in policy-making positions are also not worried about it.
Right. And Dheeraj, with this, another aspect is that the government did act with a stimulus package. The RBI did act with, giving out rate cuts. And, just this week itself, you had the finance minister who came out and actually gave another SOP with regards to where boosting consumer demand is concerned. Now, number one, do you think that is enough, or something more needs to be done? And if something more needs to be done, how much of a stimulus as a percentage of GDP is what India as a country can afford, according to you?
So I think more should be done. I think what the government has done so far is welcome. I think the recent measures would certainly help boost demand a little bit, but not by the scale we need. When we're talking about an extraordinary situation where quarterly growth has been minus 24, annual growth could be minus 10. So 1-2% stimulus is not enough. You have to look at least a 5-6% of GDP stimulus extra. And the only indicator for me that the government is actually doing a stimulus, I mean, the two indicators. One is that it's borrowing significantly more, and second, it is that it's monetizing part of the deficit. And I think the time has come, and the situation is extraordinary enough for the government to start doing the latter, because that's really the only way you can do that quantum of fiscal stimulus. Because if you borrow too much more, you'll threaten to raise interest rates, you'll crowd out private sector borrowing. So I think in the circumstances, a certain monetization of the debt, which is normally not a good idea, and we never recommend it. And in India, I think the history has been so bad of debt monetization in the past, which has led to inflation and fall of growth rates and so on. So I think the government is right to be cautious, but this is a once in 100-year situation. So if not now, when? So I think definitely the monetization should happen. A bigger stimulus is needed. More money needs to be put into the hands of those who will spend it. That's fundamentally the thing that has to happen. Right now, in the recent stimulus package, the government has tried to put money into, for example, government employees with regard to their leave, travel allowance, and with regard to spending. So you're putting it into hands of some people, but I think you need to put it into the hands of many more people so that they start spending. That's the only way demand will revive, and that's the only way businesses will revive. So I think that definitely needs to be done. I think monetization of the deficit has to be done at this extraordinary time.
Right. So are we trying to say that fiscal monetization is one and the only option right now that the government has? And if yes, what should be the right timing according to you? Because, my conversations with a lot of government experts also on this front have been of the opinion that the government is waiting for the right time. And this is, once after they announced the first package and everyone was waiting for a second package to be announced, where they're saying that the government is actually now ready to press the accelerator without stopping. If that's the situation that we are going to probably look at and could be in our favor, what could be the right time with regards to fiscal monetization, according to you?
So I think the time is about right now, because I agree that it was not much point doing a big stimulus or doing a monetization of debt, when a lockdown was in place, or where large elements of a lockdown were in place, because that doesn't really enable people to spend the way they want to. It doesn't enable them to function normally. But I think now, more or less, most parts of the country, the lockdown has more or less been completely lifted, including hospitality sector. The things have opened up. So I think now is the time, with the festive season coming up. This is the time people spend. So this is the time I think you should do a bigger stimulus. And in the second half of the year, we're already in second half of the year. This is when you need to cut your losses and hope that the recovery is much faster. We could see some green shoots, but let's make those green shoots into bigger plants and trees. So let's do it as fast as possible. The economy will recover eventually. But do you want to take 8-9 months over it, or do you want to cut that time to 3 or 4?
Correct.
And I think now is the time to cut that time. We don't have time to waste. So I think the time is about right. You want to do it now or after 1 month, but it has to be done now. Now is really when you're looking. Otherwise, it'll be too late.
Right. And do you think we are in a desperate need of a gamut of structural reforms that could be needed from here on, particularly with regards to where job creation is concerned, investments into the country go, or even for that matter, increasing entrepreneurship in the country, because that's something which is in the end going to create jobs?
Yeah, I mean, it's my firm view. So we are talking, of course, right now about crisis and how to manage growth in a crisis. But if you look at the medium-term, long-term view, the only way you're going to raise growth to 8, 9, 10% is through investment. That's a known. You know that from our own experience, in the period between 2003 and 8, when we grew at 9 to 10% per annum, investment as a percentage of GDP was 36. Since 2011-12, it's been below 30, consistently. Similarly, in China and East Asia, when they've grown at double digits, the investment as percentage of GDP is about 40%. And private sector is going to lead this investment drive. For that, you need structural reforms, you need land reforms, labor reforms, banking reforms, You need reforms in the power sector. You need reforms in the railways. You need a whole lot of structural reforms. Agriculture has happened, which is good. But ultimately, you're right. I mean, who will drive investment? Entrepreneurs will drive investment. Foreign investment will drive it. Domestic investors will drive it. And and who will create jobs? The government can't create jobs. In fact, I think we ask the wrong questions when we say, what has the government done to create jobs? The government has to create investment and has to facilitate investment, and jobs will come from that. Jobs are a derivative, right? So I think we must do everything that's required. And as you commented earlier, India tends to do it when we have our back against the walls. We did it in 1991. And now again, the situation is dire, and we've done some very impressive moves, not only on agriculture, but for example, opening coal for commercial mining, opening railways for private train operations. So there are certain very bold steps which were never taken before, which are being taken now. And labor codes have been revised. So I think there will be a few more steps which will be taken by the government in the months and years ahead, which will yield us a growth dividend over the next decade. So I think they will not yield a dividend immediately, because right now the situation is very different from a normal situation. But come 2022 and come the recovery period, you will see precisely this will yield the benefit. The benefit. Then we won't be talking about fiscal stimulus anymore. We'll need to go back to fiscal discipline. But the private sector and private investment and exports, these are what will have to drive your growth. So I urge the government use this opportunity to do the entire gamut, complete the reform process.
Right. And then with this, we've been talking of opportunities that India could harp on. Where do you see the opportunities lying, taking this crisis into consideration?
No, I see opportunities everywhere in India. Frankly, we have underachieved so much over the decades that you know, mining, which is the sector I work in, huge potential is there. Natural resources as a whole, huge potential is there. Services, we've been very, very limited in our thinking to IT services, which have done very well for us, and telecom. But why can't India be a global leader in education and health services? I mean, why can't we set up world-class centers here? And medical tourism is there to a certain extent, but we should really be the hub for the, education and health, for example. These are new sectors. Then there'll be the new technologies which are coming, electric vehicles, renewable energy. We should be leaders here. So I think the thing is to identify sectors on, you don't even need to identify, just ease policy across sectors, deregulate sectors, and you'll see the entrepreneurs will identify those sectors and come forward. So in education, for example, we have a new education policy, but if you were to add one element, allow for profit education, you'll see a transformation of the sector, and you'll see it become a generator of jobs and GDP, and as well as educated people. It'll same with health. Health will not only generate GDP, but it'll improve your human development indicators. So these are sectors which will have huge, huge multiplier effects and provide jobs and contribute to GDP. Tourism, again, I think India has underperformed there. The manufacturing as a whole, we've underperformed. If we get our house in order, from about 15% of GDP, we can easily go up to 20% of GDP in manufacturing just by attracting firms which are leaving China. So you ask me opportunity, there are opportunities everywhere, but we have to deregulate. The government has to take a step back and has to do everything possible, whatever it takes to get investment in.
Right. And then with this, what's the view that you have with regards to the metal sector as a whole? Because with metals, a lot of other sectors which are capex heavy, a lot of industries have turned down their capex, said that we're not really going to make any major investments right now over the next couple of months. When do you see the return of the capex cycle and demand, especially for metals as a sector?
So I think you're already seeing some amount of revival, and I think the government's announcements of boosting infrastructure projects, construction activities, and now that the lockdown is also winding down, I think all of these will begin to boost the demand for metals. I think metals generally respond well to GDP growth. So as I said, additional stimulus, infrastructure spending, a revival of demand, which I see by the fourth quarter of this year and in the first quarter of the next financial year, you will see things turn around. Naturally, right now in a situation of uncertainty, a situation of slump demand, people are not going to be enthusiastic about investment. But as I said, we have to hang in there, do our best to minimize the losses over the next 3 or 6 months for the economy as a whole, and then you will see things will come back. I think India the future still belongs to India. I mean, we have a per capita income of only $2,000. You look at our per capita consumption of major metals, it's a fraction of the global average. It's a fraction of China. So the potential is huge and it's only going to grow. So I don't foresee any worry going forward as long as you have the right policy framework. You'll see many more investments coming in things like mining, metals, from overseas as well. There are a lot of people who would be interested in the India story, but we have to grow. We have to have the right policy framework.
So basically, are we trying to say that even if we see the opportunity right now, India still needs the right ecosystem to capture these kind of opportunities, and that's where we are lagging?
Yeah, so I think, in India, a lot of reform has happened, and I'm not for a minute going to say that we have not moved forward. But I think overall, somewhere in India, not just the government, but the people also, we all think that, the government has the main role and the private sector has the secondary role. I think that needs to change. I think the government has been too powerful and too regulatory in its outlook. It's been very focused on revenue, for example. Revenue always comes first, and instead production should come first. I think if production comes first, if growth comes first, revenue is a byproduct. The more you produce across metals or any other sector, the more you'll get in taxes, the more you'll grow. Whereas if you think the other way around, that how do I maximize my revenue now, then your medium-term revenue is compromised because you're squeezing a limited set of players, but your economy is not growing fast enough to give you that huge revenue that you need to spend on other things. So I think if that narrative changes in India, then nothing can stop us.
Right. And with this, what's happened is credit growth is something which is not really picking up that well. Now, yes, the RBI, do you think they should actually still develop a clear strategy from here on? Because somewhere legally they are bound to an inflation target, but yet at this juncture, there is a strong argument to look past the current spurt in inflation, as we already spoke about, and test the limits of both the conventional as well as the unconventional monetary policy. How is it that they should look at boosting the credit demand from here on?
So I think there are two aspects to it. One, I'm afraid to say that the monetary policy framework, which was a very good idea 20 years ago and is a good idea in certain circumstances, is now a bit of a limiting factor. But I was happy to see that the newly constituted Monetary Policy Committee just last week has said that it's taking a realistic view of this inflation and that it's a supply side led inflation and they're not going to change their accommodative monetary policy stance because of it. But I think that the monetary policy framework on the whole has delayed at various points the reduction of interest rates in the economy. And right now, India has one of the highest interest rates in the world. But the second part of it is that it's not only the RBI and the MPC's fault. Part of the problem is that transmission does not happen very easily in India. And I think the banking system has been in such a mess, overloaded with NPAs and unwilling to lend. That is the second part of the problem. And I think while some amount of the cleanup has happened and RBI is taking a more flexible view of NPAs and so on, I think ultimately, again, at some point, the government just has to be less cautious and go ahead with privatizing, at least 2 or 3 of the major state-owned banks. And when I say privatize, there's a mistaken impression in India that privatization means that you take a bank and you sell it to a person or a company. Don't do that. Just reduce the government stake to below 50, make it a widely held board-managed bank, the ICICI model. No single promoter owns ICICI Bank. It used to be owned by the government. It slowly divested its stake, took it below 50. It became a professional bank. So that's the way I'd like to see all the public sector banks go eventually. Widely held in the public, with government holding a certain stake, but let them function independently under professional board and professional management. That is the only way. Otherwise, sooner or later, this NPA problem will come back to bite you. Because these banks just don't work as efficiently as private banks. I mean, right now we know the situation that one private sector bank, which is HDFC, has a market cap higher than all the public sector banks put together, whereas the public sector banks have about 70% of assets. So I think this situation needs to be reversed. So I would suggest a gradual move to diluting the government stake below 50. And I think that is a bold move which also needs to be done now. Otherwise, you would find that RBI can do this and that and lower interest rates, but you won't find that appetite for credit the third factor there is that public sector banks are also governed, as you know, by this framework of CAG, CBI, CBC. All these people watching over you constantly. So there's a great fear of lending also. And I think that fear will also go away if the government stake comes below 50%. So I think that is really the way to go. And that is a reform I really look forward to in the next year.
Right. And with this, what the RBI has done so far with regards to where the moratorium goes, or even for that matter, the loan recast scheme, do you think all of this will actually help us tackle the stressed assets and NPA issue? Because what's happening is, if you see the private banks, they've been the first ones to react and raise capital to protect their balance sheet. And I was just reading a report by Moody's as well, which was indicating that the public sector needs to raise as much as 2.1 lakh crores in external capital to tackle the capital shortages from here on. What is the kind of message that we should be picking up from all of this?
So again, I think the message is very clear that capital is required, further recapitalization is required. The government does not have the money. There, as I said, in this situation, there are several competing claims. So I think the best way to go is to dilute the government's stake and let the banks raise the money from markets. It'll solve your capital problem. It'll solve your governance problems. It'll solve your efficiency problems. It'll be a win-win for everybody. And I think that is the only way forward. In the short run, of course, while we are passing through this COVID crisis, there needs to be an element of flexibility on NPAs and bad assets, because we shouldn't have a scenario where a lot of good firms go out of business or go into bankruptcy proceedings just because of COVID. I mean, they may have been perfectly sound before COVID, but COVID has given them that blow. So I think we can't afford to lose good firms, because then coming back, there's no coming back for them. And then how are you going to recover? Ultimately recovery, when it happens, is going to be based on a certain set of firms and certain set of businesses being around, to operate. So I don't think we should lose businesses in this climate. So I think flexibility which the RBI is adopting is welcome, and I think it's definitely needed to deal with the short-run issues. But I think again we have to be very careful in India that. So while we should not lose good firms, this should not be used as an excuse for bad firms to continue surviving.
Correct.
So I think it's a tough balance. Yeah. I don't think it's an easy task for the regulator. But I would rather err on the side of survival right now, because if too much of your economy just dies out, then prospects for recovery are limited. Especially SMEs and so on, which employ a large number of people and which contribute a large amount to exports. We can't afford them to fall in COVID.
Right. And then what's happening is, Dheeraj, a lot of dependence on the back of revival is coming in on rural India. However, the remittances going to rural India from urban is still low right now. Do you think it's sustainable, and do you think dependence on rural India with regards to survival or sustainability or revival is a good idea?
It's not a good idea, because I think agriculture contributes at the end of the day only 13% of GDP, 13%, and it employs 40% of the workforce. So actually, in an ironical sort of way, it's been a blessing during COVID that agriculture has grown and not contracted like the other sectors, because that has at least meant that that 40%, they don't live a very high standard, but their standards have not fallen because of agricultural growth. They're still at a certain level, and in fact, it's the urban workers who have suffered. So in the crisis, in an ironical way, it may have worked in our favor. But I think once we are out of the crisis, there's no way that 13% of GDP can support 40% of the workforce, right? It's just not possible. And no matter how fast it grows, it'll always be only 12 or 13% of GDP, and that proportion will continue to fall. That's what happens in all countries around the world. So agriculture solution, I always say, lies not in agriculture, but in industry. Until you build manufacturing and jobs outside agriculture, you will be overburdening agriculture. Agriculture needs fewer people. It needs a much more efficient outlook, which hopefully will happen with these reforms. But it needs less people who will then make a better living. Because right now there are too many people and not enough are making a decent living. And that's the problem. But that said, in this immediate crisis, it may have worked in our favor.
Absolutely. Probably it could have worked in our side for the timing, but a lot needs to be done from here on to make the most out of the opportunities that we have in hand. Thank you so much, Dheeraj, for joining us on the show. It was a pleasure to have you. Great insights that I've picked up so far. We should see you back soon again, and stay safe.
Thank you.